Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me remotely is Phil Mackintosh, chief economist at Nasdaq, to review how policymakers and investors are starting to model out the global economic impact of the coronavirus as the race is on to mitigate the spread and provide stability to the markets, consumers, and the economy. Now, stocks opened higher, adding to yesterday's gain from yesterday's 7% move higher on the S&P 500. Now, Phil, a 7% swift move down is scary, but it seems to be it's all good when it's to the upside. I realize the new data on COVID-19 is better than last week, and that's a good thing. But the impact on the economy and corporate earnings is still a very big unknown. So these, swings to the upside that we're seeing, how much do you really trust them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good news coming out, I guess, compared to what we've seen the last 3 weeks. So yesterday we talked about how there was a reduction in global cases and a reduction in US cases. And today we've seen that continue. And that's a really good sign. So when you look at countries that have got the COVID under control, they've seen the peak happen and new cases coming in start to decline. So that's the reality. Is we've at last got one data point which seems to confirm that we might actually have the coronavirus cases starting to fall, and which gives us sort of a timeline to completion of this and a return to normalcy.
And speaking of that timeline, if we take a look at our second chart here, you're looking at the public transport use for China. What are you seeing here?
Yeah, and there's a bunch of ways we could look at this, but the story we're trying to tell is just how long might we be needing to wait to return to normalcy. So this is showing that from the implementation of the movement controls in China, the lockdown, you can see it's around about 2 months from early Feb to now, and they're still not quite back to 100% in terms of congestion on roads. So obviously there's a lot of people that are still not going to work, at least not the way they used to. And when you look at the grayer lines, you can see that there's even less people comfortable getting on subways and airplanes, sort of, crowded and confined spaces where you're next to a whole lot of strangers. And that's what a lot of people are talking about in terms of, even if we get back to work, even if we're wearing masks and we're comfortable around people that we see every day, sort of our extended family, the data coming out of China and other countries shows that it's going to change our behaviors in other ways for longer periods of time, until either we have a vaccine or we have some way of knowing that people that are tested positive are going to quarantine themselves and not put everybody else at risk.
Yeah, and I think if we end on a cautionary note here, taking a look at Korea's daily increase on the chart here, I think, and as you mentioned in your note, the big unknown really is all of the untested people. And when we do go back to work, what does that look like? Is that instantaneous? Is it a process? I mean, you have that influx of millions of people going back to New York City, for example, and without a vaccine at this point, what does that mean? And I don't think that the light at the end of the tunnel is there yet.
Yeah, whereas the market today and definitely yesterday seems to be very optimistic that we're going to get over this in a shorter time frame, I guess, than some of the worst case scenarios now. The data out of Korea in this chart's a little bit scary, just because they got the spike in cases under control, but they just haven't got it down to zero yet. And it seems to be kind of hovering around the same 100 cases a day level. I mean, if you put that ratio, sort of a tenth of the peak is the current new cases in America, that would be around about 3,000 new cases a day, which is a lot of cases. And that's on the back of the fact that in the States, we are fairly comfortable in saying that there's a lot of people not getting tested, and people that are calling a doctor and explaining their symptoms but don't have breathing difficulties are often not getting tested, even though there's pretty high likelihood that they have got positive coronavirus. So it's possible the 360,000 cases in the States is actually much higher. Knowing that around about 20% of people in other countries are getting hospitalized, America could have 5 times that many cases, which is 1.8 million. Knowing from other studies that often there's about 50% more people that are asymptomatic the whole time, which is the weird thing about this disease, is some people can not even know they've got it and be spreading it, while other people get really, really sick. We could have over 2.5 million cases in America. I mean, in some case, I guess that kind of statistic becomes good news, because the recoveries are obviously much higher than the 20,000 that we've recorded as well. And as people recover, those people should have immunity and they can go back to work and they can start to relive their normal lives too. So I guess it's kind of a catch-22, but there's a big unknown in terms of how many people actually have it right now and how many people have recovered too.
All right, Phil, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
All right, thanks for joining me on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.